Thank you so much, Ed. If my panel can join me on stage, we're going to have a great debate. We'd encourage you to ask some questions. Let's challenge this panel. So please, as we kick off, think of some kind of pertinent, probing questions for us all. Fantastic. So what I'll do is that when we're settled, I'll get each panellist to do a very short introduction and an opening statement. And I'm delighted to be joined by Tim, Brent and Rolsey, who will give us a kind of diverse perspective on this big debate about the landlord and the word tenant. But the word tenant itself is a little bit due for kind of, I think, reinvention. So to begin with, we'll start with Rolsey, a quick introduction and a thought for you to open up.
Yeah, I oversee development at Lend-Lease nationally, and we're looking at a whole bunch of different challenges that are facing us in the property sector, the onset of the digital economy, as well as what tenants are asking for. And so our risk as a business is we just keep doing the same thing.
Hi everyone, it's Brent Harmon. I head up real estate and experience for Atlassian globally. And for us, what does experience mean, I think, is probably the biggest question that people may have. We're not judged, success for us isn't judged by the delivery of a service or a good or a commodity. It's actually what an Atlassian extracts from it. And so we strongly believe that the built environment is a critical manifestation of our culture and our values. And my team's responsible for creating and curating real life experiences within the workplace.
Tim O'Connor, I head up office leasing for JLL in Australia. And we work on large office development projects for the likes of Rolsey with the Lend-Lease team. And I guess the challenge for us going forward is to understand from the likes of Brent and other occupiers what it is that they really want, what do they need, so that we can work again with our clients in how we can shape that and what direction those buildings should look like in the future.
Great. So, I mean, we've heard a lot about the landlord-tenant relationship, and it used to be quite passive. The tenant was the covenant, it was kind of a revenue stream, it was very hands-off. Now things are changing, experience is really interesting, curated experience. We think tenants are looking for something new, more active management, shared amenities and so on. Can you kind of reflect on what's changing and what the kind of impact has been so far?
Sure. I'd say not enough is changing, and it's not changing fast enough. Again, I've got one perspective, but from my perspective, the current model is fundamentally flawed and broken, and it needs to change. We're a business that's doubling in size every 2 years, roughly. We're actually cash flow positive. We're a public company now, so I need to be careful about what I say, but you can go and look at our accounts. We've been a profitable business with money in the bank for a long time now, and how do we come up with a real estate strategy to align with our business strategy is very difficult, given the way that this market currently works.
So why is it broken, Brent? What's broken about it?
Well, I mean, because you've only got to look at the brief that Google released to the market that said between 40 and 100,000 square metres in Sydney. That sort of is a great indicator that they don't know themselves how much space they need, and so the fact that they have to, you have to go out and try to find space, and you can either do it one or two ways. You can take a whole chunk of space up front and carry fixed cost, which isn't too palatable to the business, or you end up in various buildings scattered throughout the CBD or surrounds, and for us that would be a disaster because of what role the workplace plays in our business, and it's, as I said, it's a physical manifestation of our values, and it's where people experience Atlassian and what it is, and so for us to have people under 5 to 10 roofs across the CBD because growth has meant that's what we've had to do would be a fundamental failure on my behalf.
Yeah. So, Rolsey, Tim, how do you respond to that?
Well, I think it starts shaking the fundamentals of what values property, and property essentially is valued at putting a multiple on a fixed term lease with known outcomes with tenants that have guarantees and credit ratings, and we're dealing with companies that have a varying degree of credit ratings, and if you applied that directly, if that was the larger take-up of your portfolio, the value of those assets would be dramatically impacted if you took today's method of valuing assets.
Yeah.
So we've got to rethink how you actually value assets by looking at what the tenure is and what the mix is, because the deal with the new tenants is a different deal to tenants that want the standard deal. And that's the register of people and buildings is going to change dramatically. So how do we deal with the new deal?
Yeah, and I think the challenge is that there isn't just the new deal now, and there's still tenants who want the traditional deal, and they've been very happy with that, and they can anticipate, because of the size and scale and nature of the business, that they can forecast 5 and 10 years out as to, with a much greater degree of accuracy, how much space they might need. But there's a hell of a lot more, the Atlassians of the world, who don't necessarily know how, over a longer period of time, what that's going to look like. So it's, as an industry, I agree with Rosie, we really need to look at it and change it, because there's disruption happening already, and we're probably, in the Australian market, not great at disrupting ourselves, but there are disruptors coming through in co-working that, as an example, give that proxy for flexibility that perhaps in our current structure the landlords can't provide.
So how do you think the product should change from an industry perspective? Before we go back to Brent, Rosie and Tim, just how do you think the product should change? And let's get Brent's reaction afterwards as well, that works.
I guess there's no magic bullet. It depends on what you're working with as the product, but you see the buildings as a community rather than a fixed asset, as Natalie described before, around ceilings and floors, and well, you still have to have space, but how does that space operate? And how do you arrange the different occupiers and what their different needs are? Because we're talking about a change of the spectrum, and how do you recreate that space to allow for the different spectrum of what they want to occur within a building or indeed a precinct?
Yeah, and I think the idea of the precinct, to Natalie's point earlier, it doesn't have to be tracts of land where you can, you've got the benefit of scale. You can do that precinct within the building, and I think so many more occupiers are looking for, the offering that goes well beyond the four walls of their office. And again, that flexibility to reduce maybe their permanent footprint, but have facilities within the building, both for the business and for their staff and clients to really benefit from.
Does that resonate, Brent?
Yeah, I was going to say, if you look at the co-working spaces and what they do and what appears to make them successful, I think the answer lies there. And they have an appetite for risk around tenure, and they create or curate an experience, and it's a sense of community. And so, I think landlords, by doing deals with the co-working spaces, in my view, are putting another degree of separation between them and the end user, and to me that makes no sense. And so, every deal you strike with the co-working space is like a pressure release valve from stopping you from disrupting yourself. Because, oh great, I just got another 10-year deal, with a good covenant. One will say whether it's a good covenant. I don't think we've been through a cycle yet, so we'll see there. And therefore there's no pent up demand or urgency around change. And the property industry, in my view, should, if I was running a trust or a REIT or something like that, I'd be waking up every morning you should feel nervous about what you're doing and pushing boundaries and taking risks. And if you can't do it within your current framework, create another framework. It was no secret to hear that people wanted a clean and smell-free taxi ride, right? And there was nothing new to the taxi drivers either, but they were unable to disrupt themselves. And there's heaps of stories that I can go through. Software is eating the world, and the sooner the property industry accepts the fact that that's going to impact them and then starts making decisions when they can make them, the better. So I'd encourage landlords to make themselves uncomfortable, take risks.
The first thing we're going to do is not to put too many seat shops at the bottom of our buildings.
So how can we take
things like that?
How can we take more risk? Where does that come from? Because the property world has been quite risk averse in a sense, hasn't it? One thing that intrigues me is that, Atlassian is obviously high growth tech firm. How does that compare to other industries, other types of firms, maybe less high growth or in different sectors? Any comparisons?
Well, I think the cost of the business or the constraint of real estate, if the business can't grow within their current footprint or within their current building, or and again, if it's a precinct, if they can't grow within that and they get to the point of what Brent just said before and they're scattered around the city, it has the same impact. Equally, a business within whatever sector doesn't want to carry space and have that ongoing overhead. So I don't think that in its is specific just to the technology industry. Right. We've seen it in the investment banking community, retail banking, into the legal sector, and I think it's widespread. So that constraint of needing to be able to get more space or drop space, I think is probably being reinforced at the moment by the technology sector and through that growth. But I think it's applicable to everyone. Yeah.
And Rolls, I mean, what else do tenants want? If you look at the old deal, the new deal, where do you see the kind of direction now for kind of tenant requirements? And is tenant the right word?
Tenants, probably a word we understand, so it's probably appropriate. But
I've been called worse.
Pardon?
I've been called worse.
Rent payers probably not appropriate either. The nature of how occupants occupy and what the basis upon which the current deal or the basic deal works is on a rate per square metre, and that's based on how many square metres per person that occupant is likely to take. And we've shifted things a bit by having activity-based working, where you can have spaces that have more than just one person per desk, and that's helped us put more and better places into our cities because occupancy rates are higher. We're having to design buildings that can take higher occupancy rates. But that's a subtle shift to the basic paradigm. What we're probably going to need to do is some sort of availability agreement, which says within the building or even a portfolio of buildings, especially for some of the larger landlords, we'll offer you that space that allows a Google to go to 40 to 100 or an Atlassian to double in size every 2 years. How that availability deal works, I have no idea, but it's going to not relate to square metres and sometimes not relate to number of people.
It's not easy, because I think if it was easy, it'd be done, because of the metrics that are in the ownership structures with investors looking at returns. So you're constantly looking at what are downtime periods and what assumptions have been built into asset plans. So that's where the big challenge comes in at the moment.
I think I've probably had a bit of a unique experience where I spent 6.5 years at Fairfax, which is a typical, stereotypical disruptee. You can look back now and there's been plenty written about it by people who are much more articulate than me. But there was a couple of moments in time that have determined where that business currently sits, and that was the opportunity to buy realestate.com.au and the opportunity to buy seek.com.au, and at both times the board said no. They didn't appear like big deals at the time, obviously, but now looking back, they were pretty fundamental to the future viability of what is Australasia's probably biggest media company. So I think what appears like little small change, like they say, incremental is always, like change always appears incremental until it's too late. It's you got to, I hate to say this, but you got to skate to where the puck's going, not where it currently is or not where it's been. And if you're constantly just looking at the demand profile that's sitting in front of you now, and you're solving for that, just given the construction time and the way the market changes, you're going to be behind the 8 ball. So someone has to be bold, and someone has to get out in front of this and say, I'm going to do this differently, and they may fail. And if they partner with the right tenant, then I think that's okay too, right? Startups and that fail all the time. I think our culture here is we have a fear of failure, which is holding us back. I think
fail fast is important.
Yeah.
Very West Coast.
Exactly. Yeah. And so I just encourage people to make yourselves uncomfortable as much as possible.
So should the property industry be more risk-taking and fail fast? And if Rosie, if we're moving away from dollars per square metre or per square foot, what is the measure? Where does it go? Is it per person? Is it a volume? Is it where does it head to?
I think whatever the answer is, it needs to relate to the challenges of the user. And it might be worth you talking about the New York business.
Yeah, well, we just acquired Trello, which is a really exciting acquisition for us. And I was on the acquisition team and was expecting and saw a headcount of circa 100 and thought, okay, well, we'll probably have maybe 90 in the office and maybe 10 working remotely. And what it turned out was that we had probably the exact opposite almost, not quite that, but they had upwards of, or over 70% of their workforce is remote. And so for someone who's working for a company that considers themselves pretty innovative, I was shocked. And so it opened my eyes as well that actually we're probably not pushing hard enough into the future as ourselves. It's just changing so quick. So they've built it's been announced that it was, I think, an acquisition around $400 million. It's public knowledge. So they built a $400 million company with 40 people in one office and say 60 people remote, maybe even 70, 30. And the way they attend meetings and those sorts of things is really strange, and the way they use space is really strange to me. Everyone has an office who's a designer or an engineer, and they join meetings using Zoom. And so if there's 4 people in the headquarters and 1 person joining remote, they all join from their office via Zoom. So they have no meeting rooms. And so it's really unique. I want to go in there and say, well, what the hell have you got offices for? That's so archaic. But when I run the numbers, because I don't need meeting rooms, it's hard for me to other than for me to be sort of evangelical about it, and that's not going to work. So it's interesting. Even we're learning more about the future every day as well. So.
So you add that logic of 70% remote to a prediction that I read not long ago where 70% of the workforce, professional workforce, will be consultants or contractors, which means the certainty around your tenure is different, but it also allows you to work wherever you want and you'll be a lot more mobile. So how do you, as an occupier, deal with a different changing dynamic of your workforce, and therefore how do you predict a 10-year lease with 2 5-year options?
And from a valuation point of view, how do you value that too? Like with incentive in there, it's just, to me it doesn't make sense to me. We've got artificially inflated rents. This is coming from a tenant who's got cash, so it's easy for me to say that. But why do I have to pay an inflated rent and do a side deal and get some sort of rent abatement? Like, why can't I just pay the true rent for the building? Yeah. And so I think incentives are a key thing the industry has to deal with over time. I know it's a topic no one really wants to embrace, but for tenants, particularly like us, they slow us down. They're annoying. Yeah. And they serve no purpose.
The subject now? We don't want to talk about that.
Well, let's look at this idea of workplace as a service. More and more about kind of the revenue consumption economics. Tim and Rosie, what have you seen so far, and what's the kind of direction that you think that's going to head in terms of new revenue streams for landlords and an active role in managing buildings and curating services and experience for tenants?
Yeah, I mean, I think whether there's new direct revenue streams or whether it's more a function of, again, tenants looking for and being prepared to pay the rent and within the building that provides the amenity, the infrastructure that they're seeking, so that they can support the business. And also the flexibility as well. I guess it gets back to what we're talking about as far as, looking at that long-term availability of space and being prepared to pay for the flexibility that goes with it. So it's not a separate line item, but it's wrapped up in the overall deal. And I think tenants, I think are much more prepared, and we all negotiate, we all haggle over dollars on a rate per square metre, and we talk about incentives because they're things that are very easily measurable. And so the industry gets very fixated. To that point, we label buildings, whether they're premium or A. I don't think tenants look at it as the same way as what we probably do on the owner-investor side. We really look at how that building can support, or the occupier looks at how that building can support the business. What is wrapped up in the overall value proposition and what they'll be prepared to pay, as opposed to having separate income streams. But Rosie might have a different view.
Yeah, no, I agree. I guess the examples of some of the co-working arrangements is they're happy to pay a premium on a base normal deal because they're providing that experience, and so obviously they're handing that down to people who would rather pay a bit more to be in that space with that experience. It's curated, it's got amenities that are shared, facilities that they can access. So the experience is different, and therefore the nature of that charge is different. And then you look at the total occupancy cost on a per head basis, and the cost of property compared to wages is sort of circa sub 10%.
Yeah.
So you're dealing in an area that's not going to change the dial dramatically around what it costs to run your business. But getting back to Brent's first comment, and his measure is the experience he provides, it's going to come back to that every time.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So Brent, would you pay more for an enhanced experience or shared amenities? And if so, what would be of value to
We'd
address
never
you?
pay more.
You wouldn't pay more?
No, we'd pay what's fair.
Okay.
That's probably...
Can you say something differently up
well, I'm not going to sit in front of a room full of landlords and say we're going to pay more for something without them offering me more. So when they become best in class at offering a service like that, then maybe I'll consider it. But I think that there's a long way to go, and it's just the start of that journey. I'd encourage landlords to go and buy 3 desks at WeWork or wherever and sit there and watch it and see how it works. There's no magic to it. Yeah. There's just a desire to want to offer a different sort of service. I think I would much rather have a relationship directly with the building owner because I think that enables the greatest flexibility over time, and I think the solution lies in taking a portfolio view, not a per asset view. Yeah. Because if you're constantly looking at it by an asset view, you may take a huge haircut to have it last year for 5 years in a building, and then because we're growing, we might move to another building in the portfolio. And then so it doesn't make sense for building A, but it helps building B, and when you add up all that together with other tenants, you've got a portfolio that returns a value that a certain investor would be prepared to put their money in. I think that would stack up. I'm completely ignorant to whether it would or not, but for me that seems to make sense. That if I've got, say $700-800 million of rent to spend over 10 years, if I was a landlord, I'd be wanting to lock that in and put it in my back pocket and doing whatever I could to keep hold of that instead of sign it up for 5 years and then send them somewhere else for the next 5 and 5 after that.
So just stepping back, I mean, hypothetically, what would you pay more for? What kind of value would you see in a product or a service to support your business that's high growth and you want to enhance?
Flexibility.
That's the key.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah.
I mean, there is no end state for us, the way that our industry is set up is that you sort of do a project, and usually the impetus for the project is a lease expiry or something, or a business-led initiative, and you design this space, and you assume that there's this end state in place, and it's foolhardy. There is no end state. Everything's constantly changing. So the last thing you want to do is create a space that becomes a ball and chain holding you back in the past. You want to create a space that's flexible so that it can reshape and mould itself around the business and act as a springboard to take it into the future. So flexibility around how the space operates, but also flexibility around lease terms is critical, and we definitely pay a premium for that. How much depends on the level of flexibility.
So what do we think about this portfolio relationship? Can the property industry grow into that so that actually it sees it less as the individual asset, but more a kind of relationship between a client and its growth and the portfolio overall? How could that work?
Potentially, that's, I guess, the opportunity. Property's very mature and held with a fixed number of owners generally. It's not totally scattered, so there's an ability for these larger REIT-style owners to think about a portfolio. They're managed very well across a whole number of assets. The problem is the end ownership is always a little bit different, and you've got to try and deal with that somehow. But at a portfolio approach, I'm sure there's a way to try and crack that nut.
I think if I think about some of the Asian markets, they've probably had a better ability, and there's probably some examples in markets like Hong Kong and maybe Singapore where I guess you do have some very large dominant landlords who have that portfolio on the scale. They don't have as longer lease terms, and they don't, to Brent's point, they don't have this incentive structure. So it's probably made them historically a bit more nimble and way to, to be able to deal with it. Now, are they developing as good a product, as good a place? Well, that's the question. But in terms of the real estate component to it, there's been a better ability to deliver on what we're talking about.
So does the audience, anyone want to fire a question at the panel? Does anyone have any kind of response to that or want to challenge them? If you do, please raise a hand. Yeah, so there's a question right down at the front here. Get a microphone.
While that's
What?
coming,
Yep.
one of the challenges is the tax system without putting barriers up, the way the REITs work and how tax, non-taxable trusts work, sort of goes to the incentive-based scheme as well. So we need to rethink some of the rules to allow that to happen.
Okay.
Hello. Hello? Yep. I think someone quite well known on this stage, maybe Rolsey, said once that you move from white collar to blue collar to no collar, and I think it's quite clearly demonstrated on the stage. Is there a danger? Is there a danger that the property sector is still stuck in the white collar phase and needs to actually shift to the no collars phase? And how are you going to do that?
I think yes, you are. I don't think that's open for debate. I think the discussion needs to move on to how quickly can we as an industry move to the future. That's so, yeah. And these guys' job to solve that, not me.
I mean, one thing that we're seeing is the kind of diminishing length of the life expectancy of businesses. I mean, all the research is showing that the average tenure is about 10 years in North America. For a big quoted company, it's come down dramatically to something in the 30s and from the 50-year plus. How can the property industry respond to the idea that startups kind of come and go and there's uncertainty? What should happen?
It's a very good question. I think that I've looked at the same statistics and wonder how much they're influenced by some smaller companies that sort of do come and go and influence that number. But because I think we'd see a much higher incidence of delinquencies on leases and things in Australia if it was that case. But to Rolsey's point as well, the prediction around organisations having a much higher proportion of the workforce being a much greater proportion of consultants going forward is certainly going to change things. I think at the moment we either continue to allow the co-working piece to steal the march and to be that barrier in between, or again, that change really does need to occur, and it comes back to the length of lease, I think.
So again, getting back to that portfolio discussion, if you had a portfolio of 200,000 square metres and 10% of that was actively promoting shorter term, less corporate tenants, and the analysts measured you and said, okay, we get that, you need to go there, so we're not going to devalue your asset stock as a result of that, then everyone's going to go, hallelujah, we can actually start thinking about the same as you have A grade, B grade, C grade space. Yeah. And Sydney's a good example at the moment where if you've got B grade space, the rent's probably gone from $500 to $800 a square metre because there's a lack of it. So it's now playing in the A grade space. So you look at it on a broader perspective, and if it's, let's say it is 10%, that is a massive amount of area that we don't. It's probably less than 1% now, and gradually that acceptance will not affect your asset register, but you can actually cater for different companies over time.
So Brent, you mentioned co-working and the WeWork brand that's got the valuation we're all aware of, but you said you didn't want that intermediary. You want the landlords to be offering something of that kind of ilk directly. Well, what's your ideal? What would you like to see?
Well, I think it's just basic economics. If there's a middle person, there's a cut getting taken out of it, and so as an end user, you end up paying for it. Or the middle person's not making money, and then you're in a pretty perilous position. Yeah. Look, I think it just makes sense. I've always been a big believer in landlords, having as much control over their assets as possible, and then getting to know their tenants because they're the people they're servicing, and so having a middle person just makes no sense to me, other than the fact it ticks the box around length of tenure, covenant strength, and those sorts of things. And so that's all it's doing at the moment, and it's actually creating more harm than good, I believe.
Interesting. How should we respond, Rosie? What's the answer?
I think the role of the manager then shifts to do that. It's a curation role rather than an asset management, get up, turn the chillers on every morning type role, because what the co-working spaces do, they curate space, they bring speakers in, they organise things, they have spaces carved up differently to simply, you're on level 11, press the button and your security card gets you there. So it's got to shift what we design in our buildings, but also who manages, what their backgrounds are. They're not asset manager 101, they're probably going to come from an entertainment background. So the nature of who we employ will also be different.
Interesting. Do you think landlords are ready for that? What skill sets need to kind of come into that world to bring those people in and create the right...
I think the question is, can they afford not to be ready for it?
Right.
It's going to happen.
Yeah.
Now, whether it's high net worth individuals coming together or what, the change is coming. It's just whether they want to be a part of it or not, I think.
But even some of our major occupants and some representatives from Commonwealth Bank are here, they're doing that in themselves. They're changing the nature of their workplace in themselves.
Yeah.
And we've just got to keep up with it.
And Brent, you mentioned you're in charge of experience. I mean, what is the experience that your people, your talent wants out of kind of coming to an office and coming to a workplace?
I think something that, well, it almost should become invisible and it just sort of melts into the background. It's sort of, you know, and it just needs to be, you know, the single most important thing for us is our values, and they truly guide everything that we do. And so what what we do with the physical needs to be a physical manifestation, as I said before, of our values. So what they want to do is they want to come to work, have as little friction as possible to do the best work of their lives, and that they're signing up to something bigger than themselves, bigger than their office. There's a company mission there to unleash the potential in every team, and that's what they're here to do, and the best work of their lives. And so my team's responsible for helping make that a reality. And it's just the little things. It's the length of lift ride. It's the ability to bring dogs into work. It's just the little things that may help someone have a better time at work, and therefore they're more productive. So for the hard heads in the room, it's not all group hugs and kumbaya. There's some fundamental economics underpin it all. If you've got an engaged employee, they're producing at their best, you're going to make more money. And so sometimes it's a tenuous link, but logic should help you bridge that gap, I think.
Yeah.
And that's the challenge. Sorry, I was just going to say, I mean, that is really around the people component to it, the attraction of the best people, the retention of those best people, and how do we bridge that gap then between what that business is prepared to pay, given that the people component is the biggest cost that they have. And we just got to get away from perhaps this rate per square metre to price in some of the flexibility and price in the experience part. But it's a lot easier said than done.
I struggle with it every budget. How do I argue the value add of my team? It's hard to quantify. So I can imagine it's hard for people who aren't as close. But the important thing I think for me is that is just to get out of the way. Just let these. Typically going forward, businesses will be younger, they'll grow faster, they'll fail faster. And so, this whole idea of passive management is dead. I don't think anyone who's passive in a role today, I suspect that role won't be around for long. So if you yourself don't have a passive that enables you to be passive, then why are we passively managing assets? It just sort of doesn't make sense to me.
That's really interesting. So that's the end of our kind of session. I want to leave you with one vision from the panel. So if you could say one thing to the audience that you'd like them to kind of do actively, not passively, to kind of make a difference to this industry, what would the one thing be? So Tim, if there was one takeaway for the audience to kind of change, what do you reckon that would be?
That's a really good question, Phil. It's a bit motherhoodish, but I think we've got to look at how we properly in the industry, how we do disrupt ourselves. And we used the taxi and Uber example before. I think it will happen. It's a case, and it may happen somewhere else in the globe, and then we'll adopt it. I think the challenge for us is to be the first ones to really embrace it and make that change, as opposed to piggybacking off someone else.
Royalty, what do you think?
I think we talk about property management as a known thing. I think we've got to drop the word property and call it experience. Change the nature of people we employ.
And Brent, so the message to the audience, less passive, less friction. What should we do differently?
I always say to my team that 90% of what you do you should feel 100% comfortable with, but talk to me about the 10% that gives you that feeling when you've lost your wallet. You know, that like 10% of everything you do you should feel like that, and if you don't feel like that, then you're not pushing the boundaries hard enough. So I'd encourage people to do that.
So wallets at the back later on. Can you join me in thanking our panel? Great debate. Rolsey, Brent, Tim, thank you very much.
Thank you very much to our panel and to our moderator as well. And we